Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 40. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 77 and 78 of the Prima Pars, that is, the powers of the soul in general and the specific powers of the soul. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the Second and Revised Edition translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, and so here we go. Yesterday we talked about what man is. Form and matter, soul and body, composite. In this episode and in the next couple episodes, we will talk about what he can do. But before we do that, it will be advantageous to recall some of the ground we have covered thus far. First, we have taken note of the consensus between the ancients like Aristotle and the more recent scientists like Werner Heisenberg that the most fundamental principle of all material things, that thing which everything material is made up of, is mere, raw, potential existence. What Heisenberg likes to call energy, what we call matter. Second, we noted that for this potential existence to actually exist, there must be a cause for its actual existence and for existing in the way that it does, either as a hydrogen atom, stone, dog, or human. This cause is what we mean by the form. Thirdly, the form of the human body, which makes you and I to exist, and to exist with all the capabilities that we have, is what we mean by the soul. Now, in this episode, we will delineate what those capacities are, those capabilities. But one more thought before we begin, a helpful analogy from Dr. Fazer, which should help to tie together these already mentioned points. Imagine staring at the face of a clock that has only the minute hand, and the minute hand is spinning rapidly across the clock. That's kind of like what formless matter is. Sheer potential to exist as any material thing, and of all those possibilities or hours on the clock it's spinning by, it will stop on one of those particular material things once informed by some form. It will be limited to a particular kind of thing or hour on the clock, if we're using that analogy. And it would be even better to say not that the hour hand or the minute hand will stop on a particular part of the clock once informed by some form, but that it will then be limited to moving within a limited range of that clock. Because even when matter begins to actually exist under the form of an orange tree, let's say, that tree still has potential in it, potential to grow, potential to bear fruit, or to move towards the sun. So in conclusion, and bringing this entire preface of our episode home, when it comes to us, your soul, the form, takes matter, that sheer potential existence, causes it to exist, and causes it to exist in such a way that it, or you, now, the body-soul composite, has a very particular range of capabilities or faculties. You can sense, you can grow, all of the potentials that you have, because the soul has taken that spinning clock or that formless matter and limited its spinning to, let's say, between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. It has limited that formless matter to some range of all those potentials that exist in you, and that can come in and out of actuality as you choose or think or sense or grow, etc. And so again, this episode and the ones to follow will be concerned with looking at what exactly are those specifically human potentials or capacities or capabilities that exist within this metaphorical 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock of the informed matter, which is our human being. Now, hopefully that was helpful between the analogy, the explanation after it, the description before it, and understanding the articles of this episode. So here we go. Article 1, whether the essence of the soul is its power. In response to this article, consider the following hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're in China and you're staring at a Chinese billboard on the street. In order for you to be able to understand it, the writing on it, you're going to need a couple of things. First, you're going to need to exist. That's what your soul is doing, informing your body, causing you, the body-soul composite, to exist. Secondly, you're going to have to be the kind of thing that has the ability to understand, just generally speaking. That ability is what we call the power or faculty of the intellect. Thirdly, you're going to have to know Chinese, or have on you or in you the habitual knowledge of what those scribbled figures mean, what those figures are meant to signify. And lastly, you're going to have to not just be staring at that billboard, but actually trying to read or understand the scribbled figures on it. And we could say much more, but at the very least, in this process of understanding what the Chinese sign means, we can distinguish a couple of things. The first, the soul causing you to exist. Second, the power of the intellect in the soul allowing you to understand in general. Third, the habitual knowledge of Chinese in the mind, allowing you to understand Chinese specifically. And then fourth, the actual act of understanding and trying to read the Chinese. Now, the present article is asking whether the first and the second of that list are identical. And the answer is no, and Aquinas gives us two reasons why. The first is that if your essence was identical to your powers, your capabilities, you would be God, because only in God, in which there is no division or potential, is his power identical to his essence, identical to his existence. Secondly, if your faculties were identical to your essence, then at every moment you were actually existing, you would also have to be actually thinking, willing, imagining, seeing, touching, etc. All of the things you have the power of doing, which is clearly not our experience of ourselves. Therefore, there must be some distinction in you between what you can do, your faculties or powers, and your act of existing at any moment as a human being. Article 2, whether there are several powers of the soul. If what you are able to do, your powers or faculties, is distinct from your mere act of existing, the essence of your soul, then the next question is, what are those faculties? Are there multiple faculties in you or just one? Aquinas writes, of necessity we must place several powers in the soul. He then explains first that since everything attains its perfection through its operation, the plant through growth, the animal through sense, and us through the perfect contemplation of God in the beatific vision, and since the better a thing is, the fewer actions will be necessary for it to reach its perfection. He probably has the angels in mind here. But since we are at the bottom of intellectual things with a supernatural end, we will need multiple powers and acts to reach our goal. He also says, another reason why the human soul abounds in a variety of powers is because it is on the confines or on the edge of spiritual and corporal creatures, and therefore the powers of both meet together in the soul. Article 3, whether the powers are distinguished by their acts and objects. Incredibly important article here, because the faculties of the soul are not distinguished by being in a different place or being of a different kind of stuff, since their principle is all in the one soul, which is informing your body, unless one means that some of these powers are in a place, meaning they are in a corporal organ, meaning they are operating through that organ, like the power of sight through the eye. But then what about the faculties of intellect and will? How are they distinguished? Because not only do they not take up space, being thoroughly immaterial, but also do not operate through a bodily organ. And if these faculties are distinct, which we know just from our own experience of ourselves they are, then what makes them distinct? Aquinas says powers are distinguished by their acts and objects. Acts like seeing, objects like color. For example, in the act of seeing that object, which is color, we realize that we have the power of sight. Now that's an easy example. Others can be more difficult. Another example, in the act of getting the essence of things, we realize that we have the power of understanding as well. And then based upon these differing acts and objects of these faculties, we come to understand the difference between them, between the power of understanding and the power of sight. And that's pretty straightforward, God willing. Article 4, whether among the powers of the soul there is order. And of the kinds of orders St. Thomas gives in this article, the one to zoom in on, which is just as relevant today as it was in Aquinas' day, is what he calls the order of superiority, namely that the powers of sense or the faculties to take in nutrition or to move ourselves, these are all for the sake of our higher faculties, that is, the intellect and will. St. Thomas writes, "Perfect things are by their nature prior to imperfect things. Thus, according to the first kind of order among the powers, the intellectual powers are prior to the sensitive powers, wherefore they direct them and command them. Likewise, the sensitive powers are prior in this order to the powers of nutrition, generation, and growth." Article 5, whether all the powers of the soul are in the soul as their subject. Where are these powers or faculties housed, is our question. Are they just in the soul? St. Thomas cites Aristotle, who says, "Sense belongs neither to the soul nor to the body, but to the composite." Then Aquinas takes that, quote, explains it, and responds to this article very clearly. So we will simply quote him. He says, "The subject of power is of necessity the subject of operation. Now it is clear from what we have said above that some operations of the soul are performed without a corporal organ, as is understanding and will. Hence the powers of these operations are in the soul as their subject. But some operations of the soul are performed by means of corporal organs, as sight by the eye, as hearing by the ear. And so it is with all the other operations of the nutritive and sensitive parts. Therefore, the powers, which are the principles of these operations, have their subject in the composite, and not in the soul only." Article 6, whether the powers of the soul flow from its essence, St. Thomas says, "It is clear that all the powers of the soul, whether their subject be in the soul alone or the composite, flow from the essence of the soul as from their principle." Aquinas will then explain that the soul makes the body to exist as the human body, and so the faculties of the body, as well as any qualities or powers to be found solely in the soul itself, must flow from or find their origin in the soul's being, the soul giving existence to the body and existing subsistently. Therefore, yes, the powers of man flow from the essence of the soul. Article 7, whether one power of the soul arises from another, St. Thomas says, "Powers are known by their acts, but the act of one power is caused by the act of another power, as the act of the imagination by the act of the senses. Therefore, one power of the soul is caused by another." As an example, we can't imagine the brown dog unless we have first seen that brown dog, and we cannot know what a dog is unless we have seen multiple of them, and from there abstracted within the mind the underlying essence among them. So yes, in this way, one power of the soul, let's say sense, gives rise to another, imagination, by allowing the other power to carry out its proper action. Article 8, whether all the powers remain in the soul when separated from the body. St. Thomas gives us a tidy, brief response. He says, "As we have said already, all the powers of the soul belong to the soul alone as their principle, but some powers belong to the soul alone as their subject, namely the intelligence and the will. These powers must remain in the soul after the destruction of the body. But other powers are subjected in the composite, such as the powers of the sensitive and nutritive parts. So it is false that, as some say, these powers remain in the soul even after the corruption of the body. It is much more false that, as they say also, the acts of these powers remain in the separate soul, because these powers have no act apart from the corporal organ." And with that, we move on to the next question. Question 78, the specific powers of the soul. Article 1, whether there are to be distinguished 5 categories of powers within the soul. Now keep in mind as we go through this article that these powers are distinct by object and act, but they are united in or within that one thing which is making you one thing, which is the soul. The faculties of the plant and the dog, we also have those faculties, but without dividing us into multiple kinds of things, but as within the one thing that we are, the one rational soul informing the body. And so in this question, we will look at each of these categories of faculties. And St. Thomas begins this first article by quoting Aristotle, who wrote, "The powers are the vegetative, the sensitive, the appetitive, the locomotion, and the intellectual." And I would definitely recommend reading the text of this article because of how rich it is, but in brief, there are three kinds of living material things out there, very broadly speaking. The first is the plant. Its powers do not extend far beyond its material. It can grow, take in nutrition, reproduce, and move itself. The second kind of thing is the animal, with the power of sense. Its power reaches out to sense anything sensible. It can see, smell, hear, etc. It has interior senses as well, which we're going to see in a later article as applied to us and in many ways shared with animals. The third is the rational animal. We have all the powers below us just named, but our faculties reach out not just to particular sensed things, but even to the notion of being, of goodness. Our intellect reaches out to the nature of things, the world behind the world. And we are looking for not just particular goods, but we are looking for goodness, which is God himself. We call the powers of the plant, the vegetative powers, the powers of the animal, the sensitive powers, and the powers unique to us, the intellectual powers. Then the faculties common to each of these categories are those other terms from Aristotle: locomotion, the ability to move oneself, and appetite, the inclination which anything has for something, which in sensual creatures and intellectual creatures follows upon our apprehension of those things, either as sensed or with us as known. Article 2, whether the parts of the vegetative soul are fittingly described as the nutritive, augmentative, and generative. And please don't panic on the use of the word soul here. Again, what we mean by soul in the broadest sense is just the form of a thing that is living. So are the powers of the plant fittingly described as nutritive, augmentative, and generative? Yes, because that's what plants do. They take in nourishment, they grow, they create others like themselves. As Aristotle says, the operations of this soul are generation, the use of food, and growth. Article 3, whether the 5 exterior senses are properly distinguished. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. This is our shorthand list of the senses. Aquinas will then describe them according to the physics of his day, which I'm not necessarily saying invalidates his conclusions on how the senses work, most especially when it comes to the sense of sight, which has of late seen a renewal in academic writings and interest by neo-Thomistic philosophers, but for the scope of our podcast and for time's sake, we will continue on. Article 4, whether the interior senses are suitably distinguished. What are the interior senses? This will probably strike the everyday listener as a novel term. Well, first of all, the exterior senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, they don't sense one another. And yet we do get the sense that the donut we see, taste, and touch is the same donut. So then what is this sense pulling all these senses into one common sensual experience that we are having? And we can't say the intellect because the mind knows the essence of things, general things, but this is a particular sensual experience. Therefore, this first interior sense we can distinguish in Aquinas' names is called the common sense, which is a sensible name based on what it senses. Then we have the power of imagination. We can think about a horse and a rhino and combine those images to think about a unicorn. We also have the power to remember particular images and events in the past, to reminisce upon them, the power of memory. And we also have a kind of natural instinct, not entirely dissimilar to how the lamb just knows when it sees the wolf that it's bad for it, as well as the bird in seeing straw, knowing that it would be advantageous for building a nest. And so Aquinas concludes, there is no need to assign more than 4 interior powers of the sensitive part, namely the common sense, the imagination, and the estimative, that would be like our instinct sense, and the memorative powers. And tomorrow we will go over the intellectual powers, but that brings us to the end of this episode. We have just covered questions 77 and 78 of the Prima Pars. That is the powers of the soul in general and the specific powers of the soul. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.